Thank you all for joining us. I'm Myron Cohen, and I'm the director of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University. Our institute is delighted to host tonight's talk by Bi-khim Hsiao on political progress and change in Taiwan, a DPP perspective. At this juncture, less than 2 months away from Taiwan's 2012 presidential and legislative elections, it is most fitting to bring you this special lecture as part of the Weatherhead Institute's ongoing series, Leadership Change in East and Southeast Asia. Our first two events in this series examine Japanese politics in the aftermath of the Tohoku disaster and the Noda administration's economic policy. This was followed by a conference on power dynamics in Northeast Asia, particularly in regard to the Korean Peninsula and its relations with China and Russia. Tonight our focus is on Taiwan, and I'm especially looking forward to this lecture, for much of my own research has been concerned with Taiwan culture and society and with the impact on these areas of profound political change. Now, I'd like to invite my colleague, Professor Andrew Nathan, to say a few words. He is class of 1919 professor of political science and a Weatherhead East Asian Institute member and also a former director. Professor Nathan will introduce our special guest and moderate the discussion that follows.
Well, it's a tremendous pleasure to introduce Bi-khim to you. As you may know, she has a master's degree from Columbia in political science, and she was my student. At least I claim that she was my student. She's a very distinguished, one of my very students that I'm very proud of. She went to Oberlin before she came to Columbia, and then she came to Columbia, got the master's degree, and then she went back to Taiwan and became involved in the affairs of the Minjindang, the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan, and has been, I would say, the chief foreign affairs expert of that party for a long, long time. In 1995, she was the founder. The DPP created an office in Washington. She was the founder of that office and the first representative there. And then she went back to Taiwan and served as the director for international affairs of the DPP, and has been in that position almost ever since, up until now, when she has a position as the director of international affairs for the current presidential campaign. So in those for 15 years, Bi-khim has been the internationally best known spokesperson for the DPP's international policy. Her English is absolutely perfect. So she's very much trusted. I've seen her in various meetings, and you'll see it today, answering difficult questions, and meetings with Americans, meetings with Chinese. She's extremely trusted by all of the interlocutors, except the KMT maybe, for her, but also by them for her straightforward, clear answers to complicated questions that arise. Now, during the presidency of Chen Shui-bian, during the campaign of Chen Shui-bian, and when he was president, she was his chief English language spokesperson and interpreter. And I remember one time, I think it was in 1999 or in 2000, before he had declared his candidacy, when he was, you may remember that Chen Shui-bian had been the mayor of Taipei, and then he finished his term as the mayor of Taipei, and he was the sort of presidential candidate in waiting, but he hadn't been nominated, so he was unofficial. And he came to Washington, and I know that, and Bi-khim came along, and they had some very, I believe, I wasn't there, but difficult meetings in Washington. And then I invited him to come to Columbia to give a talk. And some of you may know that I often serve as the interpreter for speakers who come and speak in Chinese. So I told Bi-khim, I'll interpret. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
So Chun, we were, I don't remember. Yes, but we were on the 6th floor, I think. And so he's, I don't know if some of you have heard Chun Shui-bian speak, but he has this very, very complicated legal sentence structure and legal vocabulary, some of which he has made up himself, you know. So he started to speak, and I found myself completely baffled, and Bi-khim was sitting there, and I looked at her, and she translated that sentence, and I said, go on, and he gave another sentence. I couldn't figure it out, so she translated that, so I gave up, and she did the whole translation. But she worked throughout the Chun administration in the foreign affairs area, and she also worked for the next DPP candidate, Xie Changting, in his presidential campaign. Now she's working with the presidential campaign of Tsai Ing-wen as the international affairs director for that campaign. And of course, the foreign policy of the DPP is an extremely important issue for the election, for Taiwan, for the US. It's a very important area where she's so influential. As well, she's been put by the DPP on its at-large list, the Bufan Chu Daibiao, and has been assigned by the headquarters to campaign in Hualien. She was just telling me that Hualien, which is on the East Coast, is a place where the DPP doesn't have a very strong base and only won 22% of the vote the last time around. So she has to go there, and she has to raise the money to pay for her own transportation to go to Hualien and campaign and to attend endless weddings and funerals. That's how you campaign. So she's had to eat a great deal of food. And she's not hungry anymore tonight. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce Bi-khim, and I know you're going to enjoy her talk. You want to come up here? Is that convenient?
Thank you, Professor Nathan and Professor Cohen, and to everyone here. And thanks for having me back. It's such a good excuse to take a small break from campaigning to come back here. It's been at least, I think the last time I was at Columbia was that occasion that Professor Nathan just mentioned with our former President Chen prior to his election and his speech here at Columbia. But I came to school here in 1993 intending to get a PhD here in the political science department of Columbia. But just a year after I came here, someone at the time said to me, I was of course in my early 20s right after college, and someone said to me, do you want to spend the next 5 years of your life in the library here at Columbia University, or do you want to go back to Taiwan and make change? And for someone at my age and all hyped up and eager to see transition and change, I made the decision to abandon my PhD program and leave Columbia. But it took me another year to finally determine that I'll leave with my terminal master's degree and not come back again. But I did leave school after a year or so and went to Washington, D.C. to start up the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party mission in Washington, and thus ending my academic or library years and beginning my life as a political activist. And I have to say that it's very, very different, but my years here or my years back at Oberlin also did help to prepare for my own political competitiveness, I should say, in local politics. But a lot of political experience had to be learned on the job and on the streets even in the process. But over the past 15 years, following my opening or taking part in opening up the DPP office in Washington, I returned to Taiwan in 1996, and that's the year that we had the first ever presidential election in our history. So we are a young democracy, only 4 elections since then. And as Andy just mentioned in the introduction, since the year 2000, I've been a spokesperson for the various presidential campaigns, and they have been quite dramatically different each time. The year 2000, I was a spokesperson. In fact, I was the MC of the rally the night that we won the election. And I was up on the stage, and of course there were huge crowds gathering at our campaign office, and there was a lot of enthusiasm that we actually won. No one expected we would win until the last week before the actual vote. And I looked to the crowd, and there's some older age people up front, and I looked at their faces. I couldn't really see the people in back, there's so many, and there were spotlights, but I was up on the stage, and I looked at the people up front, and on their faces, you know, they were saying, we've waited for this moment our whole life. You know, the opportunity to actually change a government through the democratic vote. So the year 2000 was certainly a very important year, and the first ever transition in Taiwan's politics, the transfer of power from one party to another. And we can even say that for predominantly ethnic Chinese societies, that was also a very significant moment. And I'm certainly glad that I was part of that. And then the next election was 2004, and I remember the day prior to the voting date, I was at, again, our campaign headquarters as a spokesperson, giving a briefing to a Columbia delegation headed by Tom Bernstein and Professor Gerald Curtis. And during the briefing, someone came to me. It was a small Columbia delegation with some students, and someone came to me and whispered in my ear that our president was just shot. And that was an incident in southern Taiwan where our president at the time was grazed with a bullet through his stomach. He wasn't critically wounded, but it was certainly a very dramatic event that has an impact until today, or that many people remember. So that was another drama. We won that election, but there are no celebrations because the opposition at the time demanded a recount. They did not accept the outcome of the election. And so things were low-key to ensure that unity would remain in our society. And then the next election was 2008. Again, I was on the stage the night of the vote count, and we were defeated dramatically. We lost by over 2 million votes to President Ma Ying-jeou. And I had tears in my eyes, just like a million other people in Taiwan. And that was another very dramatic event. So I've been through many dramatic elections, and I hope the next election that will take place in January will be exciting but not as dramatic. We've had transitions. I hope it will be the third political transition in Taiwan. But we certainly hope that as democracy matures in Taiwan, it can also mature with a lot of positive passion, but with a smooth transition and in predictable institutions and patterns eventually. So as this lecture series is on transition, that's just some of my experience that I wanted to share with you in the beginning. But I think I will focus my talk on some transitions that have taken place since 2008 in Taiwan politics, especially from a DPP perspective. Since I mentioned we were defeated dramatically, it was a devastating time in 2008 for the Democratic Progressive Party. We had gradually come into government in the year 2000 after being, kind of prior to the martial law days, a party from an illegal political movement that used to be called the 党外, or the outside party, because no other political party aside from the KMT was allowed in Taiwan's political system. And then we eventually grew to the extent that we won 2000 It was a difficult first time in government. After all, we had no experience at all in central government. We had to learn how to deal with a bureaucracy that had been trained to see us as the enemy of the state. We had to work with people who we knew who used to throw us in jail, or our leaders in jail. We had to figure out how to get things done after we had our ideals and we had to put them into practice. We had to start working within the system instead of from the streets. And but gradually, when we figured out how to get things done towards 2008, we lost the election and the opportunity to govern again. So in 2008, the party was divided over competitive primaries prior to that election. There were serious allegations and very painful allegations of corruption against the former president, who was the dominant figure or the leader of the DPP for many years. The party was in debt by about $5 million at the time that our party leader, Tsai Ing-wen, took over the leadership in 2008. Some people describe the DPP as being a party in ICU, in the hospital. That is, we were, almost on the verge of disappearing and, devastated. And there were a mixture of suggestions of how the party should revive itself, or whether or not we would ever revive ourselves. Some people proposed surgery, chopping off parts of the DPP, or making a cut between the party and the former president, or making a cut between the party and other factions. Some people proposed some kind of gradual therapy. Some people felt that the party would just naturally recover on its own. Some people thought the party would die and be reborn in some other form. But again, the process of recovery was not easy, and it was equally divisive. But Tsai Ing-wen, the current presidential candidate, took over and took a number of steps that enabled the party to gradually return to becoming a relevant political force in Taiwan politics. A few of the steps she took included, first of all, leading a generational change in the party. Now, Tsai Ing-wen herself is one of the first leaders of the DPP who was not politically active during the martial law period. All previous DPP leaders had either been a political victim during the martial law period, a political prisoner, or a defense lawyer for the prisoners, or a family member of political prisoners. But Tsai Ing-wen was the first one who did not have any direct relationship to actual political victimization or persecution during the martial law period. She immediately gathered the next generation of younger political activists in the party to start the recovery process. And even though times remained very difficult, she sent young people to difficult districts to try to cultivate them. I was sent to Hualien, as Andy just mentioned in the introduction. Hualien is on the east coast of Taiwan. It is the county where the DPP got the fewest in terms of percentage, the lowest voter turnout in the previous presidential election, only 22% for the DPP versus 78% for Ma Ying-jeou. No one wanted to go there. Just like when Tsai Ing-wen was elected the leader of the DPP, no one else wanted to take over the party that was in debt, that was divided and devastated. No one wanted to go there. I had no direct relationship to Hualien County, but somebody had to go. So I agreed to do that, which was very different from my traditional international work and national campaigning. Hualien is a very rural district whose main industry is agriculture and tourism. But other colleagues of mine were also sent to so-called challenging districts for the DPP, to Miaoli, also an area that's dominated by the Hakka, ethnic Hakka group in Taiwan. That's historically been a difficult area for the party. To Taoyuan County, people in their early 40s, late 30s were sent to these districts. And even though we did not necessarily win the elections, in fact, I lost my Hualien by-election, but we managed to make gains. And for a lot of the people there, they've found new faces or younger faces on the DPP, also an interesting evolution. And so we gradually recovered. That was part of the recovery process. And another thing that Tsai Ing-wen has done was to focus on small amount fundraising, what we call a 小额募款 in Mandarin. That is, in the past, and again, the allegations against our former president on corruption was certainly devastating, because the DPP had been a party that championed itself on clean politics, that had claimed to be the cleaner party against the 100-year-old KMT party apparatus that was closely linked to large businesses in Taiwan, as well as party businesses, and that still owns sizable assets in terms of party businesses. And the fact that many of the former party leaders were either have faced allegations or were detained or under investigation for corruption was certainly very much devastating. It disappointed a lot of our base that had high expectations of the party. But the party was in debt, and so she focused on rebuilding the party, refusing large donations. Some very well-known businesses in some elections tend to want to invest in both sides, investing maybe 90% in the KMT, but 10% in the DPP, and still is a sizable amount. She would refuse these large donations, but focus on the small donations in an attempt to rebuild the party's credibility as a party that relies on the people instead of a few concentrated large big businesses, to try to remove itself from the image of close ties or illegal ties to the larger companies in Taiwan that President Chen had to face in his various judicial investigations. A third thing that Tsai Ing-wen did was to refocus the party's policy discourse on domestic issues. The former President Chen, especially towards the end of his term, had chosen to use cross-strait relations, or the radicalization of cross-strait politics, as an important campaigning tool in our domestic politics. Tsai Ing-wen, while cross-strait relations remains a very, very important a very important policy issue in Taiwan, we feel that it should be an issue that unifies our people instead of dividing our people in partisan politics. So there was a refocus on a socio-economic agenda that does reflect the founding spirit of the DPP that's often been overlooked. Since most international observers, as well as political observers of Taiwan, tend to focus on the cross-strait and identity, national identity aspect of the DPP by re-emphasizing the social and economic dimension of the party, again making the connection with our traditional supporters and trying to win back their confidence was another thing that Tsai Ing-wen did. So gradually, she's not the revolutionary that our traditional party leaders are, but in her own mild and moderate way, gradually rebuilt the confidence, or public confidence, in the party that was needed. And we've won a number of by-elections. In the most recent important elections of the 5 major metropolitan districts of Taiwan, although we won only 2 out of the 5, the total vote count of the DPP exceeded the KMT by about 400,000 votes. So that puts the party pretty much on par, again, with the KMT in a very competitive race as we enter into the next presidential race. And I think what characterizes this next election as different from the past is again, the issue focus. And if we win this election, I believe we will win it on a domestic socio-economic agenda. Well, again, cross-strait relations, identity politics they remain the soul of a lot of our supporters of the party. They remain very important policy issues. However, we don't necessarily see them as election campaign issues. We have remolded a party identity to be a center-left political party. It always has been, but that identity has been lost as the dominant political discourse in Taiwan has focused on national identity issues and cross-strait politics. So I think Taiwan politics in general, in addition to the democratic transition, has also entered into a phase where political party identities is also being rewritten. In the early stage, I can say in the 1980s, the DPP versus the KMT, we championed ourselves as a party of democracy, challenging the one-party authoritarian order of the time, challenging the regime, the martial law system of the time. So it was democracy versus dictatorship or versus martial law. And through the 1990s, we continued to make progress in that area, and we had the first presidential election in '96 that was a turning point. And I think after the year 2000, the next decade could be characterized as a Taiwan identity building process, where our former president put significant efforts into building or strengthening a Taiwan identity. And that was certainly the dominant issue in the political discourse and competition. That is, we were the Taiwan-based political party against the Chinese or the pro-China KMT, or the former outside regime that transplanted itself in Taiwan. But nowadays, the KMT has been democratically elected by the people of Taiwan. And so, even though there are suspicions among some of our supporters of the political intentions, the KMT today is very different from the outside regime it was seen 2 decades ago. So today, party politics are not native versus Chinese or Taiwanese versus Chinese politics. Instead, jobs, the economy, income disparities issues, the environment, nuclear energy are becoming the dominant issues in today's politics. So in a sense, we are becoming like other normal democracies, competing on left or right politics, social issues, economic issues, welfare issues, tax issues. These are becoming the dominant political issues in Taiwan that should be in normal democracies. But our democracy has certainly been distorted by other external and identity factors over the years. Another interesting aspect of this election involves, again, those who watch Taiwan politics closely you could probably characterize if we win this election, and it's very close according to latest polls. But we have a revolution that some people can call the piggy bank revolution, and it's let me explain it. I mentioned earlier that we've rebuilt the party through small donations in terms of recovering the party's financial health and enabling a sustainable political party that relies not on big business donations but on popular participation. And recently there were some 3 little kids, triplets, who tried to make a donation by offering their piggy banks to Tsai Ing-wen. And the next day or the next week, these kids came under investigation by the government. They were accused of making an illegal donation because only people who have the right to vote in Taiwan by law can make a political donation. And so these kids were harassed, their grandparents were harassed, the party was harassed. by the control yuan that monitors such campaign donations, and where we have to declare our political funding. Usually the investigation doesn't start until after the election, but this generated a backlash, and so people started saying, well, let's start a piggy bank drive, and now there are at least 200,000 piggy banks around the country, and they're still in high demand. Out in Hualien, we have people coming to our campaign office every day asking for piggy banks, and we don't have them because the companies or the factories that produce these little plastic piggies had moved out of Taiwan many years ago. It's low-end plastic manufacturing. They're probably in China, and I don't think the Chinese regime would allow their companies to manufacture the piggies and export them over to Taiwan for our election purpose. So there's only one factory in Taiwan that makes these, and it only has a capacity of producing 5,000 piggy banks per day. And so everyone is fighting for these piggy banks, and legislators who are campaigning had to personally go to the factory to ensure that they would get the next batch of 1,000 piggy banks back to their campaign office for distribution. And there are all kinds of variations now of these piggy banks. Some of the indigenous people in my district of Hualien who are going to come to a campaign event next week told us that they are going to bring variations of indigenous style piggies to the campaign to support Tsai Ing-wen. And so this piggy bank revolution is not just about donations, it's not just about money, because obviously these are small donations, but it's about more and more public participation, and so that people feel they have an investment in this campaign, they have a part in this campaign, and that election campaigns should be about the people and about more participation, and so that will be a meaningful event. In terms of future policy and what these elections will mean, I think Taiwan is certainly at a crossroads in a number of very important policy areas. Cross-strait relations, and I can go on for an hour on that. I'm not going to go into detail unless some of you have questions on that. But how Taiwan will deal with further economic integration with China, how we will deal with our security, how we deal with sovereignty issues, with political relations with China, are certainly going to be very, very important in the next few years as China continues to rise and with greater economic and political leverage over Taiwan. But aside from that, Taiwan's future industrial structure is also, we are also at a crossroads. That in the past, we were part of the Asian economic boom by having a cost-down economic model that is, in the earlier years, providing the cheap labor or competitive labor and land policies that allowed Taiwan to become a major manufacturing center in East Asia. But as these companies have moved out to China or to Southeast Asia, what's in the future for Taiwan? For a while, our competitive advantage was in the IT sector. But as you all know, IT must be constantly renewed and renovated. It requires a high degree of innovation, and a technology that is 2 years old in terms of manufacturing is already outdated. And besides IT, what are the other new competitive edges for Taiwan? And we're at a crossroads. And this will certainly be an issue in the campaign. We have proposed to invest a significant amount of resources into new energy sectors. And Taiwan, especially the Fukushima incident recently in Japan, has reintroduced the debate on nuclear energy in Taiwan. We are a small island with 3 running nuclear plants and the fourth one being built. All of our nuclear plants are located on earthquake fault lines. Earthquakes are almost a common weekly phenomenon like out in Hualien, but once in a while we have large, tragic and devastating earthquakes. and other natural disasters. What is the future of nuclear energy in Taiwan, or new green energy in Taiwan? We certainly feel this is an area that has a lot of potential in the know-how and innovation and technologies for Taiwan. Also, there is a renewed interest in agriculture. Taiwan that has historically been kind of small farmer base. We don't have the large plots of land that you have in the United States where you can keep grain prices low, and but agricultural production costs are high in Taiwan, but at the same time they produce many jobs, and so a job-oriented economic strategy as well as a green economic strategy will have to, by necessity, seriously look at a renewed agricultural policy for Taiwan. So these are some areas where we are at a very important crossroads, and that this election or the outcome of this election will have an important impact on where the country goes in the next few years. Also, Taiwan's role in Asia and our role in the world will be impacted. The DPP has always had a kind of an activist-oriented spirit of the party that believes in not only democratizing Taiwan, but in making a connection to the region and to the world also through democracy. And as geopolitical or strategic interests in the region are shifting and the balance is shifting, we feel that it's important or critical for Taiwan to make democracy not only a moral value, but a strategic asset for Taiwan. And so we've tried to play an important role in this area by establishing not only a democracy foundation, but also trying to be more active in other areas of the region, like Burma, Thailand, Southeast Asia, linking to other forces in the region for democratic progress. How to utilize Taiwan's soft power in these areas, in addition to these traditional soft power areas of technology, culture, and sports, etc. Democracy as Taiwan's asset is not only a soft power element for linking Taiwan to the world, but it's part of Taiwan's survival as well. And it's certainly something that we hope will become an important element as we deal with China, as by necessity we have to continue to engage with China, and how we deal with the grand project of democratization of China will certainly also be a very challenging element of our relationship with China in the coming years. So I'm sorry I'm not in my most articulate state at the moment because I'm still on jet lag from Taiwan. But I just wanted to lay down the issues that are on top of the political agenda in our own transition in Taiwan. And I like the word transition in this lecture series, and I'm glad I'm part of this because it perhaps assumes that we will go into another transition. That is, there will be an opportunity for the DPP to win. But I have to say that I know that there could be a number of mainland Chinese students here in the room today, and that I think it's important for our Chinese friends to understand that even though the DPP may not be the preferred governing party for many Chinese in Taiwan, or as for many Chinese as they look at Taiwan or for their hopes and expectations of Taiwan. And indeed, there are many Chinese today who are working on preventing the DPP from coming back to government. But I have to say that transition is a normal part of democracy, and it will become a normal part of Taiwan's democracy. So the DPP will be back sooner or later, if not next year. It will be back eventually. And I think Chinese policymakers should not make the continuing control or the continuing government of a KMT as the sole indicator of the success or failure of Chinese policy towards Taiwan. And I also would encourage Chinese to engage with all sides of the political spectrum in Taiwan. I think it's not only a value but an important interest on both parts across the Taiwan Strait to have this type of interaction and engagement. The assumption that by spending more money or by threatening the people of Taiwan or by using other, if you're interested, I could share with you some of the means that I feel the Chinese are trying to influence our internal elections. I really think that there should be a certain level of tolerance or even accommodation and respect for the natural evolution of transition in Taiwan, and that should be seen as a healthy part of our interaction across the Taiwan Strait as well. So I'll just stop there. I know I've gone kind of over time with my initial remarks, but I'd welcome any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very articulate, and the timing is appropriate. And I will recognize people with questions. Yoyi?
Hello, Ms. Hsiao. My name is Zhang Youyi. I come from mainland China, and I have been to Taiwan for half a year. And thanks for a speech. I have two questions for your speech. The first one is that if we have President Ma Ying-jeou and Chairman Tsai Ing-wen to draw a map of Republic of China, both of them will draw the Taiwan island. None of them will include the mainland China or even Outer Mongolia. So what's the difference between KMT and DPP today about the definition of Republic of China? And then also, what's the difference? Does Chairman Tsai Ing-wen have alternative to Ma Ying-jeou's 3 no's? No unification, no independence, and no use of force in the cross-strait policy. So is there any difference between these two candidates in the cross-strait policy and the definition of the nation? The second question is that although in the past 6 years that both sides have become enemies, but I have confidence that we will one day become close friends. So there's many things to be done by the mainland China, but there are also many things to be done by Taiwan, especially by DPP. So can you give some advice to Chairman Tsai Ing-wen or to the audience that what DPP should do in the next few years, whether it will be elected or not, to promote friendship with mainland China? Thanks.
Sure.
Let's take a few cross-strait questions. If you have some more cross-strait questions, we'll ask them. Cross-strait, yes.
Hi, my name is Fiona. I'm from Taiwan, and I came here. I'm a freshman at Columbia College as of now. So I was wondering if the DPP gets elected next year, will it continue implementing the cross-strait policies that has been looked favorably upon by the United States and the rest of the world, such as the closer flights and the tourist policies that China has looked favorably upon? Thank you.
Thank you. Any more cross-strait? No? I'm amazed. Okay. There will be.
Wow. Okay. Regarding the first question on KMT and DPP definitions of the Republic of China, the ROC, I can't really speak for the KMT, but I can offer my interpretation of their policy. I think, let me just share with you, when the DPP first came into government after the year 2000, there used to be a map in our foreign ministry of the Republic of China that included all of China, including Mongolia. And that was the Republic of China in our foreign ministry. And the Mongolians refused to come to our foreign ministry because we included Mongolia as part of our territory. So shortly into our government, we changed the map and we removed Mongolia from the ROC map. And Mongolia established a trade office in Taipei, and we established one in Mongolia as well. So this is a gradual evolution of how ROC is defined. And Tsai Ing-wen recently said the Republic of China is Taiwan. And Ma Ying-jeou sometimes would say that, but he would also say that Taiwan is a region of the Republic of China. But I think if you want to say what are the key differences between the parties, I think both parties can agree that we want to sustain the status quo across the strait for now. That conditions are such that it's unrealistic to make unilateral changes either way. However, I think the key difference is in the future, in the end game. That is, the DPP's position is that any future change has to be agreed by the people of Taiwan through a referendum or democratic means. If there is a change in the status quo, it has to be agreed by the people of Taiwan. While the KMT, at least officially, the end game is ultimate unification, although that is not a current policy. There are very few parties, actually only the Chinese New Party and some other smaller parties that don't have any elected seats in Taiwan that would advocate unification in today's politics in Taiwan. It doesn't have a market, at least not now. So it seems a mainstream consensus in Taiwan for now is to maintain the status quo. And the key difference is in how things would evolve in the future and how we would react to the evolutions in the future. You asked about Tsai Ing-wen's policy on regards to China. I think there are a lot of different elements in our policy towards China. There's the political element, there's the security side, and there's economic side. And it's kind of complicated. You can't use the same attitude to deal with the three different areas. I think on the security side, it's very clear that despite political reconciliation or the policy that Ma Ying-jeou has carried out over the past couple years toward China, the deployment of missiles, the military buildup across the Taiwan Strait has not ceased. It has continued in a quite a very aggressive way. And so the security element is still a very serious part of our policy towards China. And I think both parties in Taiwan agree that we have to maintain a degree of security and cooperation with the United States that involves continuation of arms sales because of the continuing buildup of the threat across the Taiwan Strait. On the political side, I just outlined our political differences, and that is in the maintaining the status quo, but ultimately if there is a change, there has to be a democratic approval of such a change. I think the economic side is perhaps more complicated. It's not a yes or no question. I think even the most radical elements of the DPP will agree that it's a reality that both Taiwan, the two sides across the strait, have a high degree of economic integration, and that it is a trend that cannot be immediately reversed, no matter how much they would want to. So it's not a yes or no question. It's a matter of to what degree or how fast this integration or liberalization should take place. And the DPP position on this is that we are in favor of normalization of an economic relationship. However, we are uncomfortable with the pace that Ma Ying-jeou has been going. That is a pace that we feel is too fast. And we feel that economic integration should be accompanied by other mechanisms to soften the impact it has on our domestic economy. The outward movement of jobs of certain industries to China does raise serious internal social issues. And also further integration with China has brought about, just as in Hong Kong, greater income disparities within Taiwan. There's a lot of job insecurity, even though we have enjoyed a growth rate of about 5 or 6% on average. We had a recession also like the United States. But this growth apparently has not been shared by the middle class, by the working people in Taiwan. It has been concentrated among a few industry sectors within Taiwan. So how this integration should take place, how this economic interaction would actually benefit the people of Taiwan is a very important policy question. We welcome, and this is related to the next question, that is, we welcome Chinese tourists, and we welcome investments that are good for the industrial progress within Taiwan. However, we are against opening up investments in certain sensitive areas, such as our port facilities, telecommunications, and other critical infrastructure. But I think we are gradually moving towards a normalization process of the economic interaction. In terms of the agreements already signed across the strait, actually the direct flights that are happening now, the negotiations actually began when the DPP was in government. Even though a lot of people have this stereotype of the DPP as being closed to China, but we actually initiated the negotiations for direct flights when we were in government. As long as our security is not jeopardized, the reduction of the cost, the transaction cost, and traveling across the Taiwan Strait is welcomed by most people, and it also helps to facilitate tourism to Taiwan. You know, in fact, when I've been campaigning, it's interesting because some Chinese tourist groups like to take photos of our political campaigns, and we've been told that part of the favorite activity among some Chinese tourists is to watch our political talk shows in the hotels at night. And that's very different, or something that the Chinese do not have the opportunity to enjoy in mainland China. So in principle, we welcome Chinese tourists, although there have been issues about whether or not they're really spending a lot or the impact they are having on our tourist industry, and some people are making money and some aren't, and all of these are more detailed policy issues that we will have to work out. I think the bigger economic question is regarding ECFA and the future of this framework agreement or free trade agreement. Normal free trade agreements require generally a period of 10 years where the two economies would gradually be completely open to each other, and we have serious concerns about that. That we should not frame ourselves into a timeline where our negotiating leverage could be limited. But what has been signed is signed. And any government, whether it's a DPP or any future government in Taiwan, will have to honor all agreements that have been signed with other partners internationally and also across the strait. So what has been signed is signed, but what we have to do is to conduct regular reviews on the impact this agreement has on Taiwan. And if changes are necessary, if our society feels and if there is a degree of consensus that change is required, we have to do that through the democratic process. When ECFA was initially being negotiated, we adamantly opposed it because we had problems with the lack of transparency. The contents were not revealed to us, even throughout the legislative voting process, but since we had such a small minority, there's really nothing we could do about it through the legislative process. But the commitment of the DPP is that if any changes are to be made, we would assume that there has to be a large degree of public consensus, but it would be done through a legislative process. So that's how we will be dealing with the economic interaction across the strait. But I have to say that the cross-strait relationship is very important for Taiwan, the security side, the political side, but I think what's most relevant in the upcoming election is actually the economic dimension of it. I think a lot of people in Taiwan, just like the steel workers in Ohio or the auto workers in Michigan, there's a lot of anxiety when they feel, or there is the sentiment or the feeling that jobs are moving out of Taiwan and over to China. And there will be political consequences to that unless there is a rebalancing of the economic relationship. And so this is something that I think any future government will have to work on.
I have a regarding the role of political parties in Taiwan and the relationship with mainland China. Isn't with China's rise, China's growing influence not only in Southeast Asia but in the world, isn't Taiwan's going back to the mainland just inevitable? And the roles of the political parties will be how that will take place. You talk about whatever decision is made is going to be by electoral means, but we have seen for the last 10 years, for example, is because of China's growing economic influence, which is, I would say, its biggest weapon. It's not military, but economic. A lot of countries, they don't want to miss out on the Chinese market. So a lot of countries have changed their economic political ties to mainland and have been going away from Taiwan. So in the end, isn't this just inevitable that Taiwan will go back to the mainland?
Let's get some more questions. Give her a few. Yeah, over behind.
Did it have to be cross-strait related?
No.
Hi, I'm Viola, and I'm a fourth-year medical student at the medical school. Good. Thank you for coming. I just have a couple questions about, number one, what you think the role of media and journalism is in Taiwan, because I think that is kind of a big part of the whole political process, and same in America. And also, if you can comment a little bit on that New York Times article that came out, the column that came out last week. Just kind of the way that media around the world, not just in Taiwan, can affect Taiwanese politics. And the other question is about the younger generation in Taiwan. I mean, I've heard a lot of the older generation saying that the younger generation is not very politically active. They didn't really experience what the historical, with the martial law. So just kind of the way the younger generation, how you're engaging them, or what you think their role is. Because it's all, if we're talking about transition, I think media and the younger generation really is a big part of transition around the world, in America too, not just in Taiwan.
Let me get another question. Yes.
Hi.
Wait for the mic. I think they want to give you.
Hi. My name is Vivian. I just want to add on the last point because that's my question too. You know, I just turned 18. I'm beginning to think about politics in Taiwan, and the transition between the transitioning to a normal democracy, the dialogues between the two parties. I think the political language being used is still based a lot on the ancient dichotomy between the martial law period, between a revolutionary group and the ancient regime. But how are the two parties transitioning that dialogue into one of a more political and economic concerns and talking about the issues more than just the history of the two parties?